And we're back with a new episode of Agadir for Europe. I'm your host, Liam, joined here today by Russian Sam.
Hello, hello.
And today we have a really fun episode going deep into one of the most beloved movies of all time.
Yeah, we're taking you guys on vacation to Casablanca.
Yes, we are going to North Africa, hopefully to provide a pretty new perspective on a movie that a lot of you guys hopefully have seen before. If you haven't seen Casablanca, you absolutely should before you listen to the episode. Something you should also do is, if you're liking Agadir for Europe, please go on any podcast app of your choice and give us a good review, because we would love the feedback. We really want to know if you guys are enjoying this. Like Sam said, we are going to Morocco for this episode, 80 years in the past, when the film Casablanca had just reached American theaters. What's funny is that just a few weeks before that happened, American and British troops first landed in the city of Casablanca, a city on the North African coast and a port of entry to the Old World. Casablanca is a movie that so much has been written about. The incredible chemistry between Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. The themes of, patriotism versus love. The script, the soundtrack, the sense of adventure. What hasn't been discussed as much is the world that produced this movie. And this is really what we want to get into today. What was going on in North Africa, in France, and in the US of A that allowed this movie to happen? Basically, we want to talk about why Casablanca. Now, before we really get started, I know, Russian Sam, you've seen this before, right? Anything new you picked up watching it for this episode? Anything that really caught your attention?
I first saw it when I was first getting into film, naturally, because that's what all film snobs have to do. You have to go through the classics. Although I was first exposed to the movie through The Simpsons with that really famous gag where they find an alternative ending for Casablanca, that with Rick getting married to a woman who literally falls out of the sky as Hitler emerges out of his piano. Yeah, so I watched it again for this episode. I gotta say, I enjoyed it a lot. Obviously, dialogue-wise, it's very clever. It's basically something that somebody like Aaron Sorkin would like to imagine himself as doing. That he's recreating this incredible wordplay and tempo that really keeps this film going. It's not realistic, but it's great.
That is an incredibly generous comparison, and I'm sure he'd be very flattered. And also on that point, I never really noticed until this week when I saw it again that Casablanca really is kind of a comedy. And I guess I learned in the lead up to this episode that two of its screenwriters actually had primarily a comedy background, which makes a lot of sense.
Two fellows by the name of Epstein, no relation.
No, they seem like pretty good guys. Yeah, I think from now on, whenever I hear the name Epstein, I'm going to be thinking of these guys, Julius and Philip, the twin brothers who worked in this movie.
And of course, Casablanca is a real location. You can actually go there today.
Absolutely, yeah. And you might not be surprised to hear that for decades now, plenty of American tourists have been visiting Casablanca, presumably to the annoyance of locals, and recreating scenes from the movie.
I wonder if there's a bootleg Rick's bar somewhere in Casablanca run by a really shady proprietor who's trying to capitalize on this stuff, even though the movie is 80 years old at this point.
There absolutely is, and I read a little bit about it on the way up here. But let's take a step back first. Let's not talk about the movie Casablanca yet, and the fact that it's so beloved, it's inspiring Americans to open weird little bars, based on it. Or the fact that, it's such a cultural touchstone that it's been referenced in everything from The Simpsons to Magnum P.I. Let's talk about why Casablanca was set in the city that it was set in. And we can do a really quick crash course on the city of Casablanca and why that ended up being the setting for this unbelievably famous and beloved movie. Russian Sam, would you like to lead us off?
Yeah, sure. So the history of Casablanca actually begins well over 2,000 years ago, when it was still an outpost of a Tamazight tribe, more commonly known as Berber, but they actually prefer not to be called Berber because it comes from the word barbarian. But this port city was called Anfa. It was the farthest outpost of both the Carthaginian and Roman empires.
Right, and I think that's kind of interesting because that's sort of a recurring theme, isn't it? How it's a place that's always somewhat remote, yet at the same time is a bustling port. It's always kind of equidistant between other major areas.
So it had a long storied history. It was finally described in depth by the Andalusian historian Leo Africanus in the 15th century. Leo Africanus and presumably the people of the city knew of their own Roman heritage from long before that. But there was a lot of history in between the Romans and Casablanca of the 15th century. So in the Middle Ages, you had the Marinid dynasty, which was run by Tamazight people. They took over much of Morocco, including Casablanca, which became one of the harbors for the really famous Barbary pirates.
Oh, yeah. Again, from that word Berber.
One of the other more famous dynasties to emerge from the region is the Almohad dynasty, as they're called in European languages, but in reality it comes from the Arabic word al-Muwahhidun, in other words, the monotheists, essentially. And these guys were known for being very zealous religiously and ultimately invading this Spanish peninsula, which at that point had broken up into a bunch of little states called taifas, and taking it over.
Anyone who's taken elementary school Spanish will recognize the word Almohad as the Spanish word for pillow today. Pillow, Almohad, Ottoman, I guess people love turning Islamic dynasties into furniture.
So there was a constant flow of these dynasties starting from Morocco and going into Iberia. And naturally, after the Spanish and the Catalans and the Portuguese retook the peninsula and kicked out the Muslims, they returned the favor by trying to Christianize Northern Africa.
Yeah, which wasn't very successful, especially compared to the much more successful efforts to Islamicize Iberia.
Yeah, they didn't have a lot of luck. They were successful in taking over some cities right on the sea, some of which are Spanish territories to this day. And this was a very strategic area. It was vitally important because basically, if you look at a map, you'll see that between Morocco and the Iberian Peninsula, there's this very narrow stream of water called the Straits of Gibraltar, which are literally like 8 miles across, I believe.
Yeah. You can see Africa from Europe and vice versa.
Yeah, so if you can control the land around that area, then you control who has access going into and out of the Mediterranean Sea, which even after America was discovered in the 15th century, remained a very important place of trade and commerce.
Right. And there was another kind of motivating factor here, too, for pushing into North Africa, in addition to, trade and the whole revenge aspect because of the Reconquista. And that was those Barbary pirates, like we mentioned before, because raids from the North African coast onto European villages, as well as raids of European fleets, were a pretty big crisis for a lot of Southern European monarchies. So as a way to hopefully clamp down on these pirate attacks, the Portuguese especially began to capture lots of small coastal towns where these pirates might be based. One of these towns was Anfa, which they would eventually build a white fortress, which they would describe as Casablanca.
Yeah, so speaking of Portugal, North Africa was the site of many shenanigans by both the Spanish and the Portuguese. In the 16th century, they finally goofed a little too hard, and basically they set out on a crusade, which ended with the death of pretty much everybody in the Portuguese royal family. So there was practically nobody left to take the throne except for this one guy who had trained to be a priest his entire life because he was a younger son and they didn't think that he would come in handy. He was quite down the list, but they pulled him out of a monastery and they made him the king for a couple of years, which is, as far as I know, one of the only examples of a priest in Europe actually becoming the king of a secular state.
Becoming vested, yeah. Yeah, and of course, unsurprisingly, because he was a priest, he did not marry, did not have children, and the dynasty went extinct. And eventually, they would have a personal union with the Spanish for a very long time. Speaking of the Spanish around this time, this is in 1492, so a few decades before that failed crusade. Infamously, the Sephardi Jews, who were a pretty sizable part of the population, would be expelled from Spain. They would go all over Western Europe. You'd have Sephardi Jewish communities in France, in Britain, in the Netherlands, in Italy, even as far north as Hamburg. But a major destination, probably the biggest for these refugees, would be Morocco, including the city of Casablanca, which touches on a pretty important theme later in the Casablanca's history, which is a huge part of the movie. the fact that it would often be a center of refugees, including many refugees trying to go somewhere else. And then again in 1609, after that failed crusade, you would have tens of thousands of Spanish Muslims now be expelled. And again, these guys would be going to Morocco. So there's a pretty long history of, population movements across both sides of the Straits of Gibraltar. And even though Casablanca seems pretty far from Europe on the map, Casablanca always is on the periphery of European politics, which is pretty cool to think about.
Yeah, and all this stuff would come roaring back in the late 19th and early 20th century as colonial ventures actually started going, and suddenly the Spanish discovered that, we have a shared heritage with these guys in North Africa. We should take dominion over them since, we're related by blood and culture and all those things. So they rightfully belong to us and not those stinky French.
Well, hey, let's talk about that. Across the 18th century, Morocco slowly becomes more incorporated into European politics and economy. A big thing is that Moroccan textiles, like the famous rugs, are very prized in Europe. Eventually, though, Europeans would be less interested in actually buying these pre-made rugs and instead simply purchasing raw wool from sheep raised in the North African mountains. As a consequence, you have a large presence of European, particularly French and Spanish wool merchants living in Morocco, Casablanca in particular, and increasingly bringing Morocco into the Western European orbit.
So in the early 20th century, Germany comes roaring onto the world stage with a vengeance, and suddenly they find that they really want some colonies. And they find that Morocco hadn't been formally colonized by anyone yet at that point, even though the Spanish and the French had been staking their claims over it for a while. So they basically almost started a war over it in 1903, I believe it was. That was the first Agadir Crisis. And that deal, it would ultimately result in Morocco being moved closer to France and Spain specifically. But in 1911, again, there was another war scare over in Agadir because the Germans were, once again, very persistent in the idea that they want to control this place because, again, it's a very strategic location. It controls the entrance to the Mediterranean. So whoever controls that has a significant amount of control.
Yeah, and also we should mention that Morocco is one of the only countries, along with France and Spain, to have a coast on both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. So the overland route through Morocco is a great way to get from one to the other, as happens in the movie Casablanca.
Yeah, so the Second Agadir Crisis, it doesn't turn into a war. That would have to wait until a couple of years later. But at that point, this was the point when the Treaty of Fez was signed in 1912, which divided the country into 3 separate administrative zones. Liam, would you like to tell our listeners what that was about?
In the south was the French protectorate over the bulk of the country, whereas in the north, especially along the Rif region, Spain had authority. Funnily enough, though, the city of Tangiers was a really strange situation. It was an international condominium where different European powers jointly ran the city as an international zone. Every so often you see this again in places like Samoa, for instance.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind is that Morocco was never really formally a colony. Much like Tunisia, they maintained their sovereignty. The Sultan of Morocco continued to be the head of state, and both the French and the Spanish administrations, in theory, would have to consult him before undertaking any decision, and any decision would have to be made in his name. But nevertheless, in practice, it was very clear who the top dog was over here.
Yeah, and as a consequence of this European influence, we mentioned the Spanish and French wool merchants before. That population would quickly blossom. You wouldn't have as many Europeans living in Morocco as you'd have in French Algeria next door, which was totally colonized to the extent that it was even formally incorporated into the French state. But you'd still see a pretty big population of foreigners emerging in Morocco. And again, Casablanca in particular, where about a third of the population would be Europeans, overwhelmingly French. Among the native Moroccans themselves, you also had a lot of diversity among the various Berber tribes, also among the Arab speakers, and then, as we mentioned, a pretty big population of Sephardi Jews, some of them who might have still spoken a language based on Spanish at this point.
And so history marched on. We're skipping over a lot of very important stuff. But all you really have to know is that in 1939, World War II breaks out, as I'm sure you guys remember from your history class. Hopefully you remember that one. And it very quickly leads to a situation where France falls under German military occupation in June of 1940, and the collaborationist Vichy government emerges, which would extend its control over the colonies that France held before the war. And we can see that the movie, even though there are very few signs that it actually takes place in Morocco, aside from the opening sequence, we can see that it's French possession by the fact that there is a very prominent poster of Pétain in the beginning as a man gets shot for attempting to flee the police.
Yeah. Can you read what the poster says and translate that, Sam?
So the poster reads, Je tiens mes promesses, même celles des autres, which translates to, I keep my promises, even those of others, which was an actual slogan used by the Vichy government.
Well, and that's kind of interesting. And this kind of gets to an important question we're going to be talking about here as we talk about what the Vichy government was. So what were the promises that Pétain and the Vichy government claimed they would be upholding, even now that they were operating underneath the auspices of Nazi Germany?
Well, the promise was that France had signed an armistice with Nazi Germany under the leadership of General Pétain, who was now the head of state. But there were some French who really didn't like this idea. The most prominent example of this tendency was General Charles de Gaulle, who would go on to become the head of state of France in the post-war period. But the promises here refers to the fact that Pétain, as the legitimate head of France, had promised that that he would sign the armistice with the Germans and he would cease to fight against them, whereas de Gaulle and his followers were traitors to France who were attacking Germany despite the fact that the legitimate government of France was saying that this is not something that you should be doing.
This kind of reminds me of in the US, you had Nazi sympathizers using this kind of phony pacifist stance, right? Where people like Lindbergh would say, like, oh, I'm not pro-Nazi, I'm just anti-war. This kind of seems like a similar thing here.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. We'll get into it soon, but to really get into it, we first have to explain how the Vichy government emerged.
And I guess we should say, just to start off, if anyone's not aware, Vichy is a city in the south of France where this government was based. And it's a not a very large or important city. So I'm kind of surprised they chose that one. And do you have any idea why that was?
It's not even the city. It's more of a resort town. The reason why they chose it is that basically they were fleeing south as the Germans were advancing. And first they tried to set up a government in Bordeaux. But as the Germans were getting closer to Bordeaux, they decided to settle on this little town called Vichy, which had the advantage of having a lot of hotel space, which meant that they would be able to house the entire French administration in this otherwise unremarkable and quite small town. I mean, it was actually very famous as a resort town. I believe it was popularized by Napoleon III for its mineral waters, which were supposed to heal many ailments.
Yeah, people loved that back then, didn't they?
Yeah, they still do, but unfortunately, the Vichy name has been tarnished by this particular historical episode.
Nazis, they ruin everything.
Yeah, so anyway, Vichy was a very peculiar institution, and we have to understand how it came to be. And to do that, we have to start in the 1930s. As we talked about a bit in the first interwar episode that we did, France was hit the hardest out of any of the Allied powers. And in World War I, they lost an enormous percentage of their population. They had a lot of wounded. They had a lot of a destruction of farmland and industry, etc. So it was a very difficult recovery for France. And on top of that, the Third Republic, which was established in 1870 and whose first real task was to put down the Paris Commune, it had acquired a very particular reputation over the years. If you associate one word with the Third Republic, it would be decadence. Yeah, so French interwar politics, they became very contentious to the point where impasse really was the name of the game. Just to give you guys an idea of how intense it was, between 1919 and 1940, France had 47 different governments.
And this is why we love the French.
So again, just to count for you guys, that amounts to 2 governments per year on average, even more. And to top off all of that, the French political scene was also very strange based on our own modern perceptions of what constitutes left and right, because there were a lot of weird people with a lot of weird axes to grind. So you had a lot of monarchists, you had integralists, basically people who believed that the church should establish a Catholic theocracy. You had a bunch of fascists of many different stripes. You had both pro and anti-German fascists within France itself. You had the so-called neo-socialists, who are a very weird bunch, but if I had to describe them, I would say that they're basically the post-left of the 1930s. And then you had the more regular ones, the boring ones. You had, Republicans of various stripes. You had socialists. You had the communists, et cetera, et cetera. But I said all that just to give you guys an idea of what exactly was important in French political life. It differed quite a bit from contemporary Anglo-political discourse. Anti-Semitism had a much more prominent place, as did anti-Masonic politics, which was really a boogeyman of the French right, going all the way back to the French Revolution, because they held that the French Revolution was a conspiracy of the Masons and the Jews.
Yeah, you think that by the 30s they'd give up that one, but clearly not. Well, I guess, if they weren't giving up anti-Semitism, I guess why would they give up anti-Freemasonry too?
Yeah, in some ways, the French Revolution is contested to this very day. The role of the church in society was also much more important as a topic of political discussion than was in the Anglo world, because you had a lot of more bourgeois people who were very anti-clerical, who didn't like the church, who saw it as the fortress of reaction.
Right. And also we should mention that, compared to other countries in Europe, France was quite homogeneously Catholic, right? What's the joke about how Britain had 200 religions in one cheese, whereas France had 200 cheeses in one religion?
Even though you had all of these very weird factions who were able to exercise power in various ways, generally speaking, power was monopolized by the center-right and the center-left blocs. Communists were excluded until 1936, at which point you had the so-called Popular Front government, which was elected with the active participation from the communists, who did not actually join the coalition, but who supported the government from the sidelines, basically. But yeah, to add insult to injury for all the French reactionaries out there, the head of this government was the Jewish Léon Blum.
Yeah, I would assume it's probably the only Jewish person to lead a government at all in Europe, maybe ever, or certainly before World War II.
Yeah, I think he would have been the first, unless someone is really slipping my mind. But he was Jewish. He was born in 1872 in Paris to parents, both of whom came from Alsace-Lorraine, which was a region on the border of France and Germany, which had a very large Ashkenazi Jewish population. Yeah, fun fact, there was a birther controversy about Blum himself. There were a lot of rumors that he was actually born in Bulgaria.
Oh, wow, that's awful, but also kind of expected, right?
All this stuff is funny until it isn't. In the lead up to this election in February of 1936, you had a far right-wing mob of monarchists, a group called the Action Française, which nearly beat Blum to death while chanting "Kill the Jew," which was really something that catalyzed him and probably helped him win the election. And the Action Française, they were quite an old organization. They started out as an anti-Dreyfusard group.
Oh, yeah. So that's, in the Dreyfus affair, when a French Jewish officer was accused of being a German spy.
Yeah, falsely.
Right, of course.
Yeah, the Action Française, they held on. They were very loud, even though they weren't necessarily the most popular faction of the French right. They still really made a name for themselves. And of course, anti-Semitism was really their favorite whipping horse. So I came across this rather infamous Action Française poster, which responds to an incident that happened in the French Chamber of Deputies in 1938. Liam, would you like to read it?
Sure, yeah. Frenchmen, the Popular Front is insulting you when they say a Jew is as good as a Breton. This is the phrase uttered in the Chamber of Deputies by the socialist Marc Stormoy, Minister of the Interior of the Jewish Léon Blum, to Mr. Paul Ihuel, deputy from Morbihan. Natives of all the noble French provinces, will you allow yourselves to be insulted in this way by dishonest servants of the Jewish people, the plunderers of savings? Not content with just pushing for revolution and world war, the draft dodgers insult you. France for the French. So yeah, typical, awful nativist stuff, I gotta say, pretty similar to what the kind of stuff that's being said by, certain segments of the French political spectrum today.
like I said, a lot of this stuff hasn't been resolved nearly as much as we would like.
Yeah, and so the first thing that they really kind of set these guys off was that I guess there was a statement that I'm assuming it's saying that a Jewish French person might be culturally distinct, but they're still just as French as the French person from Brittany, right?
Like basically they're objecting to the idea on racial grounds because the Jews are a foreign element. In fact, when Blum was elected, there was a deputy named Xavier Vallat, who would later become the Vichy government's head of Jewish affairs. He has a rather famous quote. I remember it verbatim, but it's basically went, for the first time, there is a Semitic ruler over our Gallo-Roman country. Just to give me an idea, this was very much a racial thing. It wasn't just, the fact that Blum was Jew in religious sense, because he wasn't at all. He enjoyed a good ham. He didn't really practice the religion at all, but nevertheless, Blum's a Jew.
Oh man, yeah. I gotta say, the whole idea of the idea that there have never been Semitic people in France before. Number one, that's totally that's irrelevant, even if it was true. But number two, isn't there a city in France named after a Moroccan division that once was there in Roman times? I'm 90% sure about that.
Yeah, so the May 1936 election, which brought the Popular Front to power, would be the last until 1945 after the war. Socialists and communists won 20 and 15% of the vote, respectively. And lacking a majority, they were in coalition with the radical socialists, who were neither of those things, by the way. Radical in the sense of 1789 radical, as in freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and universal suffrage. But yeah, there were also the centre-left Republicans and miscellaneous left-leaning independents. Communists didn't participate in the government actively, as I mentioned before, because there was a fear of provoking backlash, and there was already plenty of backlash even without active communist presence. But nevertheless, the Popular Front did have one big achievement under its belt, which was right after its election. You had the so-called Matignon agreements, which is still the golden standard for labor rights. It secured wage increases, collective bargaining, the 40-hour work week, and paid vacation time for the French, none of which were guaranteed before. And it also increased government intervention in the French economy. But they weren't very good at it, honestly. That was the problem. They were neither the radicals, which their opponents portrayed them as, nor did they really know how to intervene in the economy, frankly, because as strange as it may sound today, given the reputation, France was very much a laissez-faire country back in the day. The government just sort of didn't really intervene in the economy all that much. So the Blum government was the first to actively try to intervene. In particular, they nationalized the Bank of France as well as the armaments industry. But they weren't very good at implementing things like capital controls. So you had capital flight. You had a lot of just straight-up refusals to make the economy work because the employers were pissed off that suddenly their workers have a bunch of rights. So this was in the midst of the Depression, and in some ways, in the short run, this agenda made things worse, which really put an end to the Popular Front. It would resign a year later, but funnily enough, the techniques which the Blum government first clumsily tried to use would later be deployed much more competently by the Vichy government, which was a very weird hodgepodge of all these different factions that I mentioned before, which included a very heavy element of technocracy, the idea that the economy should be managed by experts. Once the post-war government was set up under de Gaulle and all of those people, you saw all of that stuff continue under the guise of what was called a dirigisme, so directorism, which led to les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years when France was really at top of its A game, had really strong economic growth, etc. That's when all of this began. But yeah, there were a lot of problems in France. In particular, as we mentioned, there was a lot of xenophobia. And one of the main problems, really, in the discourse was the presence of immigrants and, even worse, refugees.
Right, because despite what some right-wing French people might tell you today, France has really had a very large immigrant population relative to certain other countries in Europe for way more than 100 years. There's a really long history of political refugees from all across the continent and beyond coming into Europe. And by the 1930s, about 7% of the population of France were foreign-born. Many of them were refugees, people fleeing genocides in Armenia and in Russia, as well as, the kind of general violence and low economic conditions of Poland and Italy. A lot of political refugees came to France because it was seen as this relative bastion of liberty, but for that reason, French reactionaries resented the refugees as, potential subversives. Many Germans, most of them or many of them Jewish, started coming after the Nazi ascension to power. And then you also had even more refugees coming in from Spain after the Spanish Civil War led to the, elected Republican government being thrown by the Francoist dictatorship. Eventually, there would be increasing restrictions on refugees. And then, thanks to the efforts of the French right, there was a lot of scrutiny over this large and growing refugee population. A lot of it was tinged with anti-Semitism, but also the Spaniards, who were, I assume, were all Catholic, were also viewed with a lot of suspicion, to the extent that a lot of Spanish refugees were even placed in what was basically, a concentration camp, a permanent detention camp to deal with them as they, came in fleeing violence in Spain.
And to give you guys an idea of the scale of immigration in this period, in 1985, they did a survey and they found that a quarter of the French population in 1985, again, was either foreign-born or had parents or grandparents who were foreign-born. So that's why there are a lot of people in France today who have very Italian or Spanish-sounding last names.
Yeah. I believe that the mayor of Paris is Anne Hidalgo, right? Hidalgo.
Yeah. Some other achievements of the Popular Front government included cracking down on right-wing terrorist organizations and leagues, such as Agadir Crisis, whose followers, again, had almost beaten Blum to death, and an organization called the Cagoulard, who did some really infamous bombings of the French Labor Federation and some other important targets.
Yeah, one very important thing with the Blum government was that they also promised colonial reform. So you started to see some changes happening in, colonial Morocco. And again, Morocco wasn't technically a colony, but there was still enormous French political influence. One important person who would be appointed by the Blum government was a young general named Charles Nogue that we're going to mention later. As soon as Nogue got in, the Moroccan nobility were initially freaked out by Blum. They worried that he was going to somehow impose, socialism and secularism on Morocco. But Nogue insisted that he would respect Moroccan autonomy and that he didn't really work for Blum, which would be important later.
Yeah, and again, respecting Moroccan autonomy in this context means maintaining the power of the traditional elites who were very happy to collaborate.
Right. Yeah, this wasn't any kind of, anti-colonial statement. This was just, this if anything, this was a reactionary decision, Sure, it preserved the independence of Morocco, but it effectively just, told the elites of Morocco that Moroccan workers would not benefit from any benefits being given to the French workers. It was simply a promise to the comprador class.
Yeah, but back to France. One of the contentious issues of the Blum administration was the fact that the French Republican government was being besieged by a bunch of generals who were plotting a coup attempt because they didn't like the direction that the country was going in. And in general, there was a ballooning of military spending in general because 1936, 1937, they were very worrisome years. Yeah, Blum would ultimately resign in June 1937. He lasted for a year, which was longer than average, so good for him. He came back again for about 3 weeks in 1938. But as we said previously, he was not a very good politician in terms of getting stuff done. The radicals, so-called, again, radical by 1789 standards, took the reins and reversed much of Blum's agenda. And all of this atmosphere, as I hope I've managed to convey to you, put a tone of national malaise over the entire country. The war was coming, everybody knew it, and many people did not feel really motivated to fight a war because in their calculation, the enemy was domestic. You had a partial mobilization in the lead up to Munich in 1938, but that was called off once the Munich Agreement was signed, which really dampened the mood, because you're called up to be mobilized, and then a couple of weeks later, it's suddenly, oh, never mind, you can go home now. As alluded to in the poster that we read recently, there was an anti-Semitic notion which had some popular reception that the Jews were deliberately trying to push France into the war for their own selfish, particularistic reasons.
Yeah, right. It's the idea that actually, the pacifist thing is to not resist the Nazis. Essentially, that's kind of and this actually is kind of going to touch into U.S. politics when we get to that near the end of the episode, because that was actually the fact that was such a common canard meant that a lot of Jewish Americans were initially very hesitant about being vocally anti-Nazi, because even though many of them were watching as their second cousins were being horribly persecuted and murdered by the Nazis, a lot of Jewish people worried that if they were openly anti-Nazi before most of the rest of the country would be, they would be seen as pushing the U.S. into war, and they'd be seen as somehow un-American.
To give one pithy line, which really sums up the mood, one anonymous a diplomat who was interviewed by a newspaper was quoted as saying about the political situation in France, quote, "They will go on playing politics until the Germans attack the Maginot Line," which, yikes. That's exactly what would happen in just a bit over a year.
The singer Maurice Chevalier around this time, who would later be in some American movies after he was forced to leave France, had a few songs where he talked about the fact that, even the French military was so divided by politics that, the colonel is an action français, the captain is an integralist siding with the church. You have the sergeant major who's a wild socialist. The sergeant is a wild radical. But then, despite all this, they're still excellent Frenchmen and excellent soldiers, and they all march in step. So the hope, I guess, was that even though France is so divided politically, politics ends where politics ends at the Maginot Line. So hopefully they believed that the internal divisions of France would be smoothed over in the event of the presumably inevitable German assault.
Not so. So France and Britain would declare war on Germany in September 1939 after Germany invaded Poland. There was a defense agreement with Poland between France and England, and so they were obliged to join the war. But for a very long time, nothing really happened. In fact, it was even called the Phony War, or in German, to be a very clever coinage, was Sitzkrieg.
Right, which is, a pun on Blitzkrieg.
Yeah, you saw some early attempts at action. You had the Saarland offensive in the first weeks of September 1939, which was basically supposed to draw German troops away from Poland. But the offensive was halted after just a week because Poland fell so quickly, and the French just retreated, which in retrospect was a massive mistake.
Infamously, the famous thing everyone knows about French performance in World War II is that they invested everything in the Maginot Line. So they expected the Germans to be coming at their incredibly fortified border, but instead, what do the Germans do? They go around it, right? So the French basically assumed that, they had to be going through a direct border. There's no way they wouldn't go through Belgium.
Yeah, yes. So the Maginot Line, it was a huge project. They started building it in 1929, and you just had these impenetrable turrets everywhere on the Franco-German border. You had a subterranean train system. You had 45 forts every 15 kilometers, big ones, as well as hundreds of smaller ones and casements in between that. And the Maginot Line, it's often treated as the height of French stupidity. Like, basically, they were saying to the Germans, pinky promise that you won't actually go through Belgium. But hindsight is 2020, really. The Maginot Line strategy actually made a lot of sense considering where military doctrine was at the time. Nobody really thought that Blitzkrieg was possible back then, and the lowland countries, that would be Belgium, basically, was terrible terrain for mechanized units.
Yeah, it's all a big swamp, right?
Yeah, they just thought that this land was impenetrable, so they would be able to keep the Germans holed up on the Maginot Line, and in this way to basically win in a war of attrition, because that was basically what happened to Germany in World War I. They just ran out of supplies, even though their military was still in fighting shape on paper.
Right, yeah. But this time, it wouldn't be a war of attrition. It would be very fast, and it would be so fast that you could even say it was like lightning.
Yeah, that's Blitzkrieg for you. So the idea behind Blitzkrieg is that rather than carefully organizing at the front and doing all of these battles, you concentrate all of your strength on a couple of key strategic points, and you just blitz forward. You just totally demolish everything in your way, not waiting for supply lines to catch up. And in this way, you're able to move very quickly on the assumption that you'll win before you run out of supplies, basically.
Right. And even though this was a pretty crazy gamble for the Germans, at least initially, it totally paid off. The French army was encircled, there were no available reserves, and eventually the French government had to just move further and further south. The Nazis would enter Paris, they would completely occupy the northern half of the country, and as we talked about, the French government would attempt to retreat to the resort town of Vichy.
Yeah, there was a total collapse of morale. If it was bad before the war, it got even worse now. The Germans had captured 2 million French prisoners of war, and they marched into Paris on June 14th. In addition to the Vichy government, there were also something like 6 to 8 million refugees at this point who were fleeing southward away from the Germans, to the point where the roads were just totally clogged. If you've ever seen footage of this, it's really remarkable.
Absolutely, yeah. No. Sam, paint the picture for us. It's June 1940. You have millions of refugees on the run. Paris has fallen. The remaining French government is based in Vichy, and they're trying to decide where to go next. Do we fight back? Do we end the war? What do we do? So tell us, what happened?
Yeah, so this was actually a very contentious issue within the French government because, as we'll get into later, the Vichy government was collaborationist, but they weren't really puppets in the way that many people assume when you hear the word collaborationist. So basically, they were exploring their options to continue the war effort. Some people wanted to evacuate the French army into the colonies, but basically, they just didn't have the logistics for it. They would have needed to move something like 450,000 soldiers per month, and they only had the means to move something like 60. So this wasn't an option, which resulted in the fall of the then current French administration. And a man by the name of Pétain came to the helm as the new prime minister on June 17. And Pétain, he was really the original Brandon. You know, he was an old war hero from the First World War. I believe he was renowned for his performance in Verdun.
He called everybody Jacques.
Yeah, so he was in his 80s by this point. He was clearly not at the top of his game, but he was really respected almost universally as this sort of grandfatherly figure. Who was, he was an arch conservative, but he was really the symbol of a nation in many ways. And Pétain, he makes this calculation that France cannot fight on. But Pétain, he was not just like, this kindly grandpa who just, sort of makes funny quips. He was also a very deeply conservative figure in terms of his politics. And it was at this point that a lot of people on the right of the French political spectrum, as well as some very strange defectors from the left, decided that this was an opportunity to radically reshape France to their liking. So this government, led by Pétain, it signs an armistice agreement with Germany, which results in Germany getting to occupy the northern 2/3 of France, leaving this little rump state in the southern third of France, which would be the free zone, so-called. And this situation was to continue until the war's conclusion. France was supposed to pay for its own occupation. Vichy retained civil authority on paper, but there was a lot of leeway for the Germans. They naturally didn't. They weren't sticklers for rules, really, but the positive side of this deal was that France got to keep its armies in the colonies. So basically, the colonies would be preserved. France as an empire would be preserved. The navy would be disarmed but not surrendered, and France would become a non-belligerent from that point on.
I know that initially there was some hope of the anti-collaborationists that they could somehow evacuate the French military, the entire French military, to the colonies in something similar to the evacuation at Dunkirk, but that ended up being unfeasible.
Yeah, so France becomes a non-belligerent, although, fun fact, Vichy France remained at war with Germany right up until the end, on paper.
And I think that the fact that France was a non-belligerent and the fact that it was in this kind of unique legal status during the war, that's been a great boon to French right-wingers today. Because anybody who wants to launder the history of French collaboration in the Holocaust and World War II, of which there was quite a lot, can just point to the fact that they were never technically at war with the Allies, and also the fact that they, whenever you can point to any kind of direct complicity in the Holocaust, they'll just say, oh, well, that wasn't really France, because we don't believe that the Vichy government was legitimate.
Well, funnily enough, the Vichy government, according to the letter of the French law, it was legitimate.
Right. And I think that's important to note, which means that because it wasn't really a puppet, there is an important distinction between collaborationism and, puppetry here. Because it really seems more like that the Vichy government was pursuing its own reactionary agenda underneath the Nazi aegis, but was still willingly participating in the repression and the genocide.
Yeah. So the Vichy parliament, it votes overwhelmingly to approve all of this stuff. Only 80 senators and deputies combined voted against it, not including the communists, because the communists had been excluded from both the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies in January because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is another can of worms. But basically, you had this situation in France itself, whereas in the colonies and in England, you saw something called the Free French State emerge, which was really a very minor phenomenon, all things considered. The vast majority of the French military falls in line with Vichy, and they vow to uphold their pledge to serve loyally under Marshal Pétain, who again was a war hero. So this wasn't just any old guy. This was someone who was very well regarded within France itself. But the main figure who didn't fall in line is, of course, Charles de Gaulle, who had just recently become a member of the French cabinet, and he was one of the few people who was very insistent that France should continue to resist Germany, even as other voices in favor of continuing the war fell away as they realized that the logistical difficulties here were too great to overcome. De Gaulle, he stuck to his guns. He fled to London. And he made this really stirring address on BBC, which would be replayed several times, where he calls on the French nation to stand up against the Vichy government and to continue the fight. The Vichy government naturally said that de Gaulle's actions are illegal. He doesn't really have that much going for him. He only has a couple of thousand troops at this point, but he's very important to the British as a symbol, so he gets puffed up a lot.
Right. And I guess that's kind of, and honestly, that's kind of a good metaphor for French resistance efforts in general. As far as I can tell, the French resistance was not anywhere near as effective as the kind of partisan efforts you saw in Eastern Europe and especially the Balkans, but they were a huge propaganda coup for the Allies. They could say, oh, see, the French, although we haven't, reached the shores of France yet, the French people themselves are already doing their part to overthrow the German yoke.
Yeah, but I mean, there were heroic people. Naturally, there are always heroic people in situations of war. We shouldn't underplay that. But yeah, this was the situation in France as of 1940. And now let's answer the pressing question. What exactly was Vichy, really? Was it collaborationist? I would argue yes. But if I had more words, I would say yes, but.
So why the but? Tell us.
Because collaborationism should not be taken to mean total subservience to the Reich. Vichy really had its own agenda and was prone to a lot of double dealing, even though there were people within the Vichy government who were just straight up Nazis, not even just French fascists, just straight up Nazis. They were a minority, and really they were sidelined quite effectively most of the time. For most people, this was really a matter of pragmatism. Yeah, so for example, you have the figure of Maxime Weygand.
Yeah, a very weird character.
Oh, yeah. Allegedly the illegitimate son of Emperor Charlotte of Mexico, who was married to Maximilian. It's a strange story. I don't know what to make of it. But basically, Weygand, he becomes basically the head of the French military as the war was heating up, and ultimately, under the Vichy government, he would be made the Minister of National Defense. In 1941, when he was speaking to an American diplomat who was trying to hammer out a trade deal between America and Vichy France, He said to the American, quote, "Obviously, I hope for a British victory. We all do. My primary job, however, is to keep French Africa intact for France. It is a situation in which the greatest discretion must be exercised."
Yeah. No, and I gotta say, it really sounds like to me that this guy's trying to cover his ass. And I think that when we're talking about collaborationism versus being a puppet, I think that personally, the fact that this was essentially willing collaboration with the Nazi project, I think is a lot worse. Because this implies that there was this kind of degree of autonomy to the Vichy government, that there wasn't a gun to their heads at all times, but they still participated in these efforts, which oftentimes amounted to assisting in genocide. And I think that if you look at a lot of scholarship about World War II in recent decades, this is kind of the direction it's pointing to, where it turns out that a lot of the intermediaries used by the Nazis, whether in France or in Ukraine or in especially the Baltics, it turns out that these local intermediaries are often doing a lot of the worst kind of Nazi stuff on their own accord. And I think that one an aspect of this that you know about that we'll talk about later is the fact that it seems like the Nazis were really not able to carry out the Holocaust in places where the German military was not directly present. So instead, they had to basically trust the intentions of the local intermediaries to be the same, which I think really, paints them in a much, much worse light if they were carrying out these actions on their own volition.
Yeah, but let's play devil's advocate for a second here. One common refrain from the right that you'll hear is that Vichy was the shield, basically, of France. And this was a line adopted at Pétain's trial, actually, where the idea was that the French strategy in World War II consisted of, quote, both a sword and a shield, where the Free French forces under de Gaulle acted as the sword against Nazi Germany physically. Vichy acted as the shield, protecting the French population from the worst parts of the war in a way. And this idea was actually somewhat promoted by de Gaulle and the people around him for the sake of national reconciliation. But what do you think, Liam? Should we entertain this notion?
No. This reminds me of, this is like how I believe in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. Didn't she argue that she was actually protecting the girls, that he was the abuser, not her, and that she was herself a victim? I think there's some parallels here. I think that it's that you can't have it both ways. And I think that for many decades, the French right has been attempting to launder their activities in World War II. It's their own equivalent to, the Confederate lost cause myth. The idea that that Vichy collaborationism was somehow distinct from the broader Nazi project. And like I said, it's because they want to have it both ways. They want to say that, okay, it was not a legitimate government, so we can't be blamed. French people today were not culpable, and the ones who were directly culpable were actually protecting France because they were working behind the scenes to make sure that things didn't get worse, And I think it's clear what's going on here. I think this is insincere. I don't want to say that nobody believed this, but I think that if we look at the history of what Vichy France was doing, I think it's quite clear that even if they were not formally part of the Axis itself, the actions of the Vichy state were broadly part of the Nazi German project, even if it was still a pretty bad deal for France.
Yeah, so let's look at this through the lens of facts and logic. One really telling example that I came across was the fact that after the USSR and Poland, France had the highest number of its citizens conscripted to perform forced labor in Germany, which was chronically short of laborers because the Germans had to be off in the front fighting the war, so they had to import a bunch of people from all of these places to basically work as slave labor in their factories. And over the course of Vichy collaborationism with the Germans, over 500,000 French civilians, as well as over 1 million people from among the French prisoners of war held in German custody would be forced to perform forced labor.
Well, I think all that goes to show that they weren't even a very effective shield,
Yeah, and let's look at an even less effective shield here, particularly the case of the Jews of France, which this particular facet of the discourse was recently back in the spotlight again because there was a candidate in the election called Eric Zemmour, who is far right. He was the head of the Reconquest Party, which should tell you something about this. But unusually perhaps for France, he's also an Algerian Jew who who, he's not exactly someone you would expect to be the poster child of the French far right. But nevertheless, let's just look at what this claim is based on. The main thrust of this argument is the idea that 75% of the Jews in France survived the war, and 85% of Jews with French citizenship survived the war, which is in some ways really impressive. This was the fourth highest survival rate in Europe. This compares favorably to a country like Italy, for example, which had 16% of its Jewish population deported, but stands in really stark contrast to a country like Poland, where 90% of the Jewish population was exterminated. But this really stark contrast between the worst of the Holocaust and what happened in France was pointed to by Vichy officials who were put on trial after the war for...
Yeah, right. Again, it was covering their asses during war crimes trials.
Yeah. So here's the reality of the situation. Germany, in and of itself, just did not have the means to enforce the final solution in most of the areas outside of its borders and war zones. Jewish extermination depended almost entirely on local acquiescence. So the Germans would put in a request like, hey guys, could you please pass these discriminatory laws against the Jews? Or, hey guys, can you please start sending us Jews to exterminate? And a lot of countries just didn't do that without facing many consequences. Most famously, perhaps, Bulgaria, under Tsar Boris II, I think it was, just straight up refused to hand over any of its Jews to Germany.
Yeah, and I guess Denmark also, it's a big part of their national myth.
Yeah, pretty much everyone except for literally a handful of Jews was evacuated in the middle of the night from Denmark to Sweden. Even in Romania, the Antonescu government, which is generally considered to be some of the worst collaborators, they weren't nearly as harsh when it came to the Jewish population within Romania's borders before the expansion during the war. But yeah, all of this just goes to show that these people could have very easily refused to comply while facing very few consequences aside from getting chewed out by some annoying German official. So one of the books I consulted for this episode was a book called The Jews in Vichy France by Robert Paxton and Michael Maris, which recently came out with the second edition. And in this edition, they hypothesized that the Jews in France were aided in large part by the vastness of the country, because, France is it's the biggest country in mainland Europe, I believe. So there's just a lot of space for people to hide, and there was a culture of not snitching to the authorities, basically. So a lot of Jews were able to find refuge in the French countryside among peasants who just, not necessarily because they were philo-Semitic, but just because they wanted to get one over on the government. But really, I think the most damning piece of evidence here is the fact that the Vichy government began to persecute Jews in October 1940, which was before the Germans had even asked them to do this. And Vichy was also delivering Jews to the Germans from the unoccupied zone, which included the children of these people. Again, this was not really done anywhere else that wasn't under direct German occupation. They really went above and beyond because, as we saw previously, there was a deep strain of anti-Semitism within French society, which isn't to say that the majority of French people were actively anti-Semitic, but nevertheless, this was a strain in the discourse.
And I guess that kind of brings us to another question, which comes up a lot among Vichy France, is that, so we've talked about if they were a collaborationist, if they were a puppet, but can they be considered a fascist government, or are they something else?
It's only fascism if it comes from the Bavarian region of Germany. Otherwise, it's just sparkling authoritarianism. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer in many respects because it really gets to the heart of the what is fascism debate, which is in itself just not a very simple question to answer because there are a lot of variability. Fascism is more of a vibe rather than a concrete set of policies in many respects. But what Vichy did do is it implemented the so-called National Revolution. Right,
which I guess was meant to be a deliberate, counterbalance to the French Revolution more than a century before.
Yeah, so whereas the slogan of the French Revolution would have been a liberty, equality, fraternity, the slogan of Vichy was "Work, Family, Fatherland," which really tells you a lot about the ethos. But
yeah. One thing, as you mentioned before, is that there were some outright fascists working in the Vichy government, including explicit Nazis, but they weren't always at the center of power, and they were never the majority, which is interesting. So I think that it's been described as, rather than being a fascist state, with French characteristics, Vichy was a French government that aligned itself to the broader European fascist project while pursuing their own agenda, their own reactionary agenda, with these grudges that long preceded the emergence of fascism.
Yeah, as I said previously, this was really a convenient pretext for the French right to sweep into power and to purge the political scene of its enemies on the left, which meant that French politics was a stalemate for so long. In this way, they were able to both get rid of their enemies, to start implementing their agenda to its fullest extent, and also to ensure the integrity of the empire.
Right. Okay, and so we spent a lot of time in France now. I think now it's time to go across the Mediterranean. And let's talk about what was going on in the sort of external territories under French authority in the Vichy Empire. We talked about how, although Morocco wasn't a colony per se, it was absolutely part of the French Empire. And so this is obviously the setting of our movie this evening. So tell us, what was the situation in North Africa at this time?
Well, first I'd like to start out by saying that this is not a Morocco movie at all. You just don't see Morocco, period, aside from the opening scene, which contains some really racist depictions of what a bazaar looks like. Yeah, so right after the armistice was signed on June 22nd, 1940, I believe, you had a ship called the SS Massalia leave the port of Marseille.
Which I guess is the Greek name for that's the Greek name for Marseille, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it left France and it went over to Casablanca. On board were 27 of the Vichy 80. Again, those were the people who refused to vote to ratify the armistice agreement. And these people, they went to Morocco because some of them feared that their lives were in jeopardy if they remained in France under this new government that was forming with German approval. So some of them just feared for their lives or being arrested, while some others harbored hopes that the war would continue from the colonies and that their presence would help to light the spark, which would set the whole thing aflame. These were really just a tiny fraction of the refugees who started landing in Morocco from this point.
Right. It was mostly regular people. It was, refugees fleeing conflicts across Europe, particularly Jewish people fleeing persecution in, the German sphere. As we keep saying, is that Morocco was never under the complete direct control of France and Spain, so the Sultan still had a lot of authority. And I think that a really important consequence of that is the fact that the Sultan still had supreme power at the end of the day is why refugees, in particular Jewish refugees, were able to find shelter in Morocco at all.
Yeah, so the Sultan of Morocco, he was able to protect Jews to a very significant extent, because basically per the Protectorate Agreement, he was supposed to have full control over legal matters. So he was able to use this to argue that this is his prerogative, and the French and the Spanish and the Germans have no business getting mixed up into any of this stuff. He did pass a couple of really half-hearted measures saying that the Jews have to live in specific Jewish quarters and formally banning Jews from certain professions. But for the most part, as far as I could tell, this was really unenforced. He has a rather famous quote where he said that there are no Jews in Morocco, only Moroccan subjects, which, kind of condescending, I guess. But, he saved the lives of thousands of people, so, I'm not one to complain.
It's a parallel to what was going on in Denmark with the efforts of the king there. That guy I mentioned before, Charles Nogue, who was appointed by Blum, was the resident general at this time, so essentially the primary French authority in Morocco. He was a funny guy because he was very pro-Moroccan in a sense, but this doesn't necessarily mean he was any kind of progressive. He believed that, that Moroccan participation in French colonialism was necessary to, keep putting steam in the engine. And he was very happy to, allow the Moroccan elites to maintain whatever kind of reactionary society they were trying to maintain, and potentially even, put down any upstart rebellions by the native Moroccans. Many decades earlier, there was the famous Rif War that, as I know you've talked about a lot, Sam, was kind of a breeding ground for Spanish fascism.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, Charles Nog, again, very conservative and condescending type of figure, but nevertheless, there was a certain paternalism to him where he wanted Moroccans to feel that they have a stake in the French Empire, to feel that, they're actually getting something from this, because in this way, the gears would turn without nearly as much friction. If I had to summarize this, I'd say this was colonialism with the human face.
Yeah. And speaking of colonialism, even though it was not to the same degree as the Pied Noirs in Algeria, Morocco still had a pretty large European population that now found themselves in this pretty odd political situation.
A lot of colonists were drawn to Morocco for the same reason that they had been drawn to Algeria, this idea of North Africa as a breadbasket of the Roman Empire, and the idea that the land has a lot of potential for agricultural exploitation, if only there were more water resources which could be exploited. So some of these people came over there and they hoped to set up an Algeria type situation where the local population was just totally disenfranchised and made second-class citizens in comparison to the French. And they had some success in this, but nevertheless, Nog, he was not a fan of these people and their politics because, first of all, they infringed upon the idea that Moroccans should have a stake in the empire, and so that they should have some rights. But also, funnily enough, this comes back to his conservative politics, where he just didn't believe that the population should have a lot of say over the way it's governed. So in a way, his anti-democratic feelings meant that he was able to push against these colonists who were trying to...
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because democracy would have only extended to the Europeans. That's interesting. So yeah, that's funny. Yeah, so yeah. In a sense, being anti-democratic in this situation, was better for the natives in an odd way.
As for this population of Europeans, mostly Frenchmen, just going purely off vibes, I get the sense that the French in Morocco tended to be more pro-ally than the French at home, just because there wasn't the threat of direct attack on their land, so they could afford to be a bit more aggressive. And the sympathy for the allies among the population of North Africa would come in handy very soon. But so we talked about the situation in Morocco writ large. Let's talk about Casablanca. The city saw really rapid growth. It went from a population of 67,000 in 1916 to a population of 350,000 in 1939. And because of the refugees who were flowing into the country, this number would increase in the next couple of years. And yeah, so back to the French Empire. The administrators in Morocco, even though they had pledged loyalty to Vichy and to Marshal Pétain, naturally, they hoped to stay out of the war, but it really wasn't to be. And it was at this point you saw a really wild incident in the war. Just to backtrack, once again, France is now a non-belligerent, but nevertheless, they have the second strongest navy in the Mediterranean after the British. And now that France is under the thumb of the Germans in a significant way, there's suddenly a lot of fear that this navy would fall into the hands of the Germans and the Italians, which would be a really big problem for the British. According to the terms of the armistice agreements, the Axis powers weren't supposed to touch these fleets, but I mean, would you really trust the Nazis with something that big? But yeah, the British decided that they weren't going to take any risks, and so they started confiscating all the French ships in British ports that they could get their hands on. Some of them they outright confiscated, others they scuttled to prevent them from being in a condition to actually sail. But really, the biggest operation of this kind happened in the port of Mersa el-Kabir in Algeria, which was the site of the cream of the crop of the French fleet, which is when you have the so-called Operation Catapult.
Right, and so that was when you had the famous, possibly infamous French British sinking of the French fleet, which was actually a pretty violent encounter where you had the French fleet at Mers El Kabir that was bombed by the British, and something like, 1,500 French sailors drowned. It was pretty controversial, and as far as I can tell, I don't believe the French Navy has ever really recovered from this sinking ever since then, right? I doubt the French Navy, at least in relative terms, is anywhere as big as it was before this attack. It was a huge symbolic defeat for the entire idea of a French colonial empire. You know, even though that the French Empire wouldn't be actually dismantled for a few more decades, this scuttling suddenly meant that France no longer had the capability to independently maintain a world-spanning empire.
Yeah, so let's talk about what happened. So a British fleet sailed up to Mers El Kabir, and the British admiral in charge of it contacted the commanding officer of the French fleet and told him that he had a number of options on the table, that he could either surrender the ships to the British, he could scuttle them, make them unusable. In other words, he could sail to America, or he could just refuse to yield and have the British, sink them. And this Admiral Gensoul, he was not the sharpest tool in the shed. He forwarded the terms to Vichy, but he really misrepresented it. He basically said that the British offer was either to surrender or to do battle, at which point he received an encrypted telegram from Admiral François Darlan, who we'll talk about later. He was Vichy's top admiral, and he basically told Gensoul to go to America. At this point, Gensoul, he refused to do that, and British had no choice but to attack the fleet, which resulted in the death of 1,300 French sailors, many more injured, and pretty much the entire fleet being disabled.
And yeah, it's a classic, from the French perspective, it's the classic case of the perfidious Albion, right? You know, yeah. And we should mention, though, of course, that even though the U.S. had not entered the war yet, it would not enter the war for another really couple of years. At this time, U.S. intelligence was also quite active in North Africa, covertly assisting the growing resistance networks across the French, possibly former French Empire.
Yeah. So again, France was a non-belligerent at this point, which means that America had a lot of leeway so it could continue to operate its consulates. In fact, America hadn't even entered the war yet at this point. That would only come in December 1941. But America sent a number of agents to its consulate in Casablanca to build up resistance networks across North Africa, which would be activated in the event of an invasion, which was being planned. And this is where you dig up a lot of really wacky stuff. Back to the French resistance, there's often this idea that these people were all basically Republicans or leftists of some kind, which really wasn't the case at all. And nowhere was this more clear than in North Africa, where in the city of Algiers, you had an American network which depended on the so-called Group of Five, who were all very right-wing. One of them was the editor of a fascist newspaper. The other was basically the head of the North African branch of the Vichy paramilitary youth organization. And this colonel, his name was Van Huck. He was just one of those guys, you know the type. Liam, would you do us the honors?
Whereas before they needed 1 or 2 divisions, they now need a dozen, fully equipped, Eddie told Murphy. At a particularly tense meeting, Van Hayk asked for 1 million francs to buy the support of the Moors throughout North Africa in the event of an invasion. Van Hayk also requested 100,000 francs to pay for the expenses of members who resigned from their jobs to run the resistance cell. Another payment of 5 million francs would be needed within the next month to finance operations across North Africa. And that's from the book Destination Casablanca that we used for this episode.
Yeah, so this type of guy, he really crops up pretty much everywhere where there is an opportunity to collaborate with the enemy and to make bank doing it. Moving on to more tragic matters, let's finally talk about the refugee question.
All right, yeah, so this is really bringing us back to the movie now. The fact that Casablanca, as we've talked about, just as it had been a center for refugees, including Jewish refugees in the 15th century, Casablanca in the 20th century became a major hub for people trying to get out of Europe. As the film talks about, the main port to get out of Europe was through Lisbon, but you couldn't go through Spain, you had to go through Morocco. So tons of refugees from all across Europe came to to Casablanca in hopes of leaving the country. Like we said, many were Jewish. A lot of them actually were from Spain, presumably Catholics, or just non-Jews from Spain. A lot of them were these left-wing Republicans who had actually hoped to get passage to Mexico, which had a pretty progressive government at this time, hoping to take in these, Republican refugees. Meanwhile, Argentina had this weird obsession with the Basque people because there were a lot of Basque refugees generated by pretty repressive Francoist policies against the Basque community. All these Basques wanted to leave. Argentina believed that the Basques were somehow, inherently great farmers and hard workers. So they took in all these Basque people at this time. Although Vichy was officially neutral, during this time, the Vichy government in Morocco did harass some British refugees at some point. They were Brits evacuated out of Gibraltar, and I guess as a retribution for Operation Catapult, they were hassled by the French government as they tried to get out of the country.
Yeah, they were basically kicked out of the country. Like first they were given really shitty quarters, and then less than a week later, I believe it was, they were just told, you have to get these people out of here ASAP. Meanwhile, you had 200 ships packing the harbors of Casablanca, totally packed to the brim with refugees from France who had arrived in the weeks after the armistice. And these people took a very long time to be allowed to disembark. And consequently, the conditions on these ships really massively deteriorated. It was harrowing. As I mentioned previously, the American consulate, it sort of played a very important role in Casablanca. At this point, it became really the go-to place for refugees from almost all nationalities hoping to get out. The American consulate, it was really massively understaffed just because up until recently, it was just, this really minor outpost for American tourists who got their passports stolen or something like that and who needed a new one. Yeah, but suddenly they found that they were totally swamped with all these people trying to get out. And although the ambassador in charge of the outpost was actually very sympathetic to these refugees, he just really wasn't able to do much to help them just because the United States still had a very strict immigration quota system.
Right. Yeah. You don't hear a lot about this today, but the American government was pretty hostile toward accepting Jewish refugees at this time, or any refugees.
Yeah, just to give you guys an idea, the local French officials, many of whom harbored Allied sympathies, they were usually more than willing to issue exit visas to anyone who asked them. It was just entirely on the Americans to give them one.
Yeah, although it was a very hopeful time, you could say, for people being able to leave the country, the actual process of fleeing Europe through Morocco wasn't always as virtuous as you might expect. There's a lot of cases, just like migration today, of refugees being really badly mistreated by the people who promised to get them out of there.
This is unfortunately a constant, and those people, they were just as nasty back then as they are now. To read once again from Destination Casablanca, the refugees offered stacks of cash, up to $800 for the bunk on deck in a lifeboat or even in the boiler room. By contrast, a second-class ticket on a passenger ship from Lisbon to New York cost $525. During the SS Arena's 2 months in dock, its captain and radio operator did their best to exploit the refugees. The captain made multiple agreements for 10 spots available on the ship. If he thought he could get more money, he tossed aside the last deal. When the spurned refugees tried to get their money back, he had required them to pay up front. Hobart threatened to denounce them to the Gestapo. If a female refugee wanted a spot on Hobart's ship, he demanded sex, as well as the outrageous fee. The radio operator, Samuel Hakim, also regularly visited the U.S. consulate, offering passage to the refugees waiting in line. Once the refugees paid for their spots, Hakim then tried to shake down the consulate staff for the necessary visas. He also collected fees from the refugees to make representations on their behalf. Just one example of the many, many different shady figures running around at this time trying to exploit these people.
Yeah. And it was such a chaotic time that even many people who had been quite high status before they fled suddenly found themselves, at the mercy. So a lot of quite well-connected families, like we talked about, members of the fallen French government, members of the Republican Spanish government, now were in a very precarious situation. One example of some well-known people who were in this situation were the fact that many of Sigmund Freud's relatives who had to flee the country because they were Jewish found themselves stranded from Morocco in a year because they actually arrived in Morocco 1 day late to leave as per their visa. And so because they missed the deadline by just a single day, they had to wait an entire year to get new visas.
Yeah, grim stuff. And that's a great segue to finally talk about the movie, where exit visas are a central part of the plot.
With the coming of the Second World War, many eyes in imprisoned Europe turned hopefully, or desperately, toward the freedom of the Americas. Lisbon became the great embarkation point, but not everybody could get to Lisbon directly, and so a tortuous, roundabout refugee trail sprang up. Paris to Marseille, across the Mediterranean to Oran, then by train or auto or foot across the rim of Africa to Casablanca in French Morocco. Here, the fortunate ones, through money or influence or luck, might obtain exit visas and scurry to Lisbon, and from Lisbon to the New World. But the others wait in Casablanca, and wait, and wait, and wait.
The story of Casablanca actually begins even before the outbreak of war in Europe, when playwright Murray Burnett traveled Europe with his wife, who was hoping to help her Jewish relatives flee Austria, which had recently been captured, or at least joined, with Nazi Germany. He was really shocked by the amount of anti-Semitism he witnessed, which would never been normal in the US, and the fact that all over Europe, people were trying to get out. After getting his relatives out of Austria, they traveled through France, which was still free, from the influence of the Vichy government. And on the way out, as they waited for their ship on the Mediterranean coast, they went to an American nightclub with an African-American pianist playing jazz songs in the corner. Murray Burnett was really taken aback by this very American, very diverse scene. And what really blew him away was that in this bar, you had refugees, you had Americans, and you even had some visiting Nazi dignitaries. Everybody came to this bar, which gave him the inspiration for his play, Everybody Comes to Rick's, which would, of course, be the basis of the film Casablanca. He wrote it with a friend named Joan Allison in 1939, and because the outbreak of the war meant that this kind of setting was no longer plausible in France itself, Murray actually changed the locale to Casablanca. It was a totally arbitrary decision. He didn't know anything about Morocco, and this kind of comes clear in the play and in the film, but it ended up being an incredibly consequential choice, It's a great location, it's a great name, and it would certainly do wonders for the tourism board of Morocco decades to come.
Yeah, so the plot of the play overlapped with the movie in some ways, but it also differed very significantly. It centers around the American Rick, who is this really hardened individualist who runs a wartime bar that serves all kinds of people. He, quote, sticks his neck out for nobody, as he says, although there are rumors that he has sympathies for the Allies over the Axis. And then one day, a woman named Lois comes in seeking help for her anti-fascist husband, who was trying to flee to America. Through conversations with Sam, his confidant, we learned that Rick and Lois had been lovers in Paris before the war, and that she thought that her husband was dead. But since the outbreak of the war, the two had reunited. Rick realizes that he still loves Lois, and he doesn't want her to go with her husband to America. However, when he realizes that his duty as an American trumps his love for Lois, he sticks his neck out for the first time and allows the couple to leave. And the play ends on a very somber note where Rick is alone, really uncertain what ramifications he may suffer for aiding the resistance. And that's the end of that.
Yeah, so according to Warner Brothers, they read the script, a young scriptreader had this whole pile of plays to see if any of them were good for movies. And this one scriptreader loved it, thought it had a timely setting, an exotic location, excellent melodrama, and the scriptreader noted that the lead could easily be played by George Raft, by James Cagney, or maybe even Humphrey Bogart. And so accordingly, producer Hal Wallace then bought the film, and Casablanca came to be. That's one way to tell the story of how Casablanca started, although some people involved in the production say it was actually a little bit messier.
Yeah, so the brothers who adapted the script, we mentioned their names at the top of the episode, were again Julius and Philip Epstein, who reported that the story wasn't really embraced immediately by Warner's brothers, as the executives might have you think, because in retrospect it was a huge hit and everyone would want to, talk about how they were the ones responsible for making it, but...
Nobody wants to be the guy who almost turned down Casablanca.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but the studio was really unwilling to take on this really politically sensitive project at a time when America was still neutral and you had a strong America First movement with some popularity which wanted America to stay out of the war. This would have been at the time when the invasion of Poland had happened and Britain and France had entered the war, but before Pearl Harbor. But there was a woman in the story department named Irene Glee who vouched for the script and eventually convinced the producer, Howell Wallace, that this was a project worth taking on. And then the weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Warner Brothers finally closed the deal on the script and set production to start in the beginning of 1942. In a way, you could say that Warner Brothers had their own brick arc.
So they were unsatisfied with the script as it was. They started bringing on other writers to adapt the play. One of these was a guy named Howard Koch, who's best known for accidentally helping Orson Welles accidentally convince America that aliens were invading in 1938 with the War of the Worlds broadcast. He was known as being a kind of a good adventure writer who could raise the stakes, and probably his biggest change was to add the villainous Major Strasser with a kind of classic Nazi villain in the movie.
Yeah, I gotta say, Strasser really is menacing. It was a great choice. But the Epstein brothers, this was actually a very unusual project for them because really they were comedy writers. They had just written the Christmas movie, The Man Who Came to Dinner.
Right, which everybody should see if you haven't yet.
Yeah, and so they were just assigned this project out of the blue and told to tone down the sex and add some levity.
Yeah, there was actually, in particular, there was a fear that the character of Ilsa would be too scandalous because she's, torn between two men and she's been involved with both of them. I think this is kind of sadly ironic because Ilsa is, of course, played brilliantly by, Ingrid Bergman, and she would later have her career basically ended by a messy divorce and an affair with the director Rossellini that would totally destroy her American reputation and kind of end her career.
As Koch and the Epsteins got their hands on the script, they really changed so much of what Murray Barnett had originally written, that Barnett would ultimately have a lawsuit against these people for the rights, and the popular wisdom has come to be that Casablanca kept almost nothing of its source material, the play Everybody Comes to Rick.
Decades later, when Murray Burnett was in his 80s and Ed Koch was around 90, they both were interviewed about this. It became a pretty well-known controversy. Who really wrote Casablanca? And Burnett, who is like 80-something, would say, Koch took credit for everything. He says he took this magic pencil, Eagle No. 1, he wrote it line by line, but every character in the film is my play. Everyone, without exception. And then he would, which is kind of funny because we know that actually isn't true, but then Koch would say that when asked about the idea or the myth that it was really Koch's story, Burnett would say, that's not true, but it's not easy to disprove. If you're accused of stealing a chicken and you get acquitted, everyone still thinks of you as the guy that stole the chicken. And then Howard Koch, who was about 90, when he was asked to comment, he admitted that maybe he embellished how much he added to the script, but he still insisted that it was a big improvement.
Yeah, so let's talk about the actual production.
Right. One thing I think is funny is that, as we talked about, it's set in Morocco, but the location is kind of arbitrary. In fact, it was shot at a studio lot just a couple blocks from where I am right now. It's in the suburbs of Los Angeles is where they filmed this. And you can kind of tell. It's all on a back lot. It wasn't an expensive film. It wasn't really a priority for Warner Brothers because they actually had 5 other projects being shot simultaneously. That was just how the studio system operated. And there were a lot of near misses here. There were so many kind of happy accidents that helped this be such a great union of talent. Initially, they wanted William Wyler to direct this, and although I'm sure he would have been great, he was a very different director for Michael Curtiz. He mostly made these serious dramas, whereas Michael Curtiz was mostly known for adventure movies. So the decision to choose Curtiz really gave Casablanca more of kind of a swashbuckling edge, which I think is, totally necessary to make it a fun movie. As for the casting, something I think is kind of funny is that the guy who plays Sam, the piano player, he was Dooley Wilson, this jazz musician who was named Dooley, actually. It's kind of fun fact here, a little side note, because his act was that he would do this kind of reverse minstrel routine where he would wear whiteface, and he used to start out playing these kind of like Irish parodies as this character called Dooley.
Was he allowed to do that?
Yeah. By the 40s, he was a pretty well-known mainstream musician, no longer, wearing whiteface. So they wanted a well-known musician, so they cast him. But what I find hilarious is that even though the character is a piano player, nobody checked if Dooley Wilson played the piano. The guy was a drummer. But they cast him anyway, and then they realized they actually could never actually shoot him playing piano. They had to dub in all of the piano sounds.
Well, on the plus side, he had a great singing voice.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, he makes the movie. He's such a, absolutely. Ingrid Bergman, as we mentioned, she was the female lead playing the character of Lois. I think the fact that she was foreign was a huge benefit because of her accent, that meant they had to change her to be an American to a Scandinavian. So that means, thankfully, the female lead of Casablanca would no longer be named Lois. Bergman herself actually only took the part because the role she really wanted, an adaptation of Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, had to be postponed. And so because it was postponed somewhat reluctantly, she took Casablanca in the meantime. The studio also had some reservations about Rick being cast as Humphrey Bogart. Although there was always talk about him from the beginning, they actually thought that he might have been too homely to play a romantic lead. He'd only really played gangsters before this. And there were even some early reports that Ronald Reagan actually might be cast as Rick.
God, imagine that alternate universe.
Yeah, right? We've talked about the fact that there were, so many refugees, both in Morocco and eventually in America, in the early 40s. And a lot of them were cast in this film. We've talked a few times in this podcast about the fact that the entire German film industry essentially came to the United States at this time. You also had plenty of French filmmakers and actors too. Rick's French girlfriend and his croupier in the movie were played by this married couple famous for being French celebrities, in the French film industry. And as soon as the Nazi tanks rolled in, they fled the country to America. Behind the scenes, director Michael Curtiz was a German exile of Hungarian origin who got his start in Berlin. Just like Fritz Lang, who we talked about a few episodes ago, Michael Curtiz was known as being brutally efficient and imperious. There's this kind of long-standing stereotype of German European directors being especially difficult to work with. And it seems like that was kind of true. Something that I find pretty funny about Michael Curtiz is that because he had already mastered German and French, in addition to learning to, natively speaking Hungarian, he didn't have much interest in learning English. So he really was not fluent, which I think is kind of cool, good for him. He was famous for having misremembered idioms, the Curtisisms, they call them. Probably his most famous was that when he complained that he never got enough credit for his movies, he said, "I am always the bridesmaid, never the mother."
Yeah, that rules. Speaking of Curtiz, at one point I heard an anecdote where basically someone brought him a transcript of what he said verbatim, and he was just like, "I don't understand what I'm saying here."
Yeah. Second language struggles, or in this case, I guess, fourth language struggles. Kind of some slack. I don't think there were any other Europeans in any major roles except for the composer, Max Steiner, who, funnily enough, he actually was really angry about the decision to use the song As Time Goes By. He wanted to only have his own music, not any pop songs. So that's another kind of near miss.
But you forgot perhaps the most famous of the European actors who played, a relatively minor role in this movie, but Peter Lorre.
Oh, of course. Yeah, how did I forget? Yeah, no, we just talked about M. Yeah, Peter Lorre. So he was, I believe he might have also been Hungarian. I can't remember exactly. But so he fled the country, like so many others. Yeah, he got a start in Berlin. And so Casablanca would be one of his first big American roles. And he would have a pretty strong career in the U.S., And a lot of people know him from many, many Looney Tunes parodies. His very distinctive face. He has a brief role as, one of the refugee smugglers in this movie. Like we said, Casablanca was a pretty cheap film. I know one thing that entertained you, Sam, was the fact that there was a very primitive rear projection in the Paris flashbacks when you see, the scenes of Paris flash behind them.
Yeah, great green screen technology there.
Yeah. One thing that's kind of interesting is that the production was really chaotic in a way that really frustrated Michael Curtiz, who really wanted things to be efficient. And it was so chaotic because they were constantly rewriting the script as they were filming it, which I guess was probably more common then than it is now. There were a lot of reasons for the constant rewrites, but the first reasons were the fact that it was this really turbulent, really politically sensitive time, and nobody was sure to what extent this script should involve the war. Obviously, it's about World War II, but this was a time when American troops had not yet landed on foreign soil, so it was still a pretty touchy subject.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, we talked about this a bit in the episode, but Nazi Germany was a major market for American movies all the way until 1939, which, considering the views that the Nazis had about the racial degeneracy of the United States, that's really quite a testament to American staying power.
Yeah, no, dude, everyone loves American culture. You really say what you will about the U.S., but it's popular culture industry.
So because there was this huge market in Germany, executives took a lot of pains to remove politically sensitive content to avoid the Nazi censors to, get their content out as much as possible with as little trouble as possible. And because of this, many studio executives who were themselves of Jewish ancestry really worried that the presence of explicitly Jewish characters or explicitly anti-fascist themes would alienate American Gentile audiences and potentially put a target on the back of Jewish Americans, because again, at the time there was this widespread idea that the Jews wanted France and the United States and Britain to join the war to, save the Jews, not because this was in the interest of these countries, but purely because they wanted to see Germany punished for, mistreating the Jews. And the implication was because they deserved it.
Right. And we should mention actually that Jack Warner, the head of Warner Brothers, he actually had been the victim of anti-Semitic attacks by the Klan in Ohio, which touches back to another episode we did recently. And also, I guess this all kinds of goes to show is that this might be why, even though Casablanca was an explicitly pro-American film, was, explicitly anti-Nazi and heavily involving refugees, they never explain really why these people are refugees. As far as I can tell, there are no explicitly Jewish characters in the movie.
I thought that Glasgow might be a Jewish character just because in the American context, that's usually a Jewish surname. But I looked into it, and in Europe, it's often just a regular Hungarian surname as well. So, who knows, really? It's really up in the air what people seeing this would have thought. But at the very least, there was an inkling that this story would be a story of Jews to a large extent, even if it was not made explicit.
And, in addition to the political concerns, there were a lot of much more lighthearted edits, quite literally, because the Epstein brothers, coming from this comedy background, they kept thinking of better, funnier lines to add to the script. And that's really one of the biggest differences from the source material to the film Casablanca. The play Everybody Comes to Rick's is strictly a drama. A lot of the lines are kept in the film, but they're always punctuated by a joke. And a lot of these jokes are probably the most famous parts of Casablanca. Like I said, it really is a comedy, and I had forgotten that. Like, there's so many famous funny moments, like when the guy's caught gambling, the famous, "Oh, you're winning, sir," all of that. The part where they tell the woman they tell the refugee guy to bet on 24 to get off. These are all added, and a lot of these scenes were actually added late into production because they came to mind. And so many of these famous moments that really make the film shine were just slipped in at the last minute, often to the frustration of Michael Curtiz.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the bit where the German general is refused entry into the gambling room, and he's just like, "I shall report this to the Angriff."
Oh, yeah. yeah. And then it was one where it's like, they say, can you imagine the Nazis in New York? And he says, "Oh, well, there's some neighborhoods in New York I would advise you guys not to go in." Yeah, that's cute. Yeah. The classic tough New Yorker, Rick. One thing we should also mention is that the French officer Renault, who's a pretty big character, he's played by the British actor Claude Rains. He is a lot friendlier in the movie than the source material. He's much more of a villainous character, much more of this kind of menacing collaborationist in the original. And this is why the character Strasser was created, kind of to spin off many of his more villainous aspects to this new villain. And now he's made sort of an accomplice in Rick's assistance of the Laszlo's escape.
But probably the biggest mark that this movie had in popular culture is the line, "Round up the usual suspects."
Right, and that's a line that almost didn't happen.
It just came to the Epstein brothers one night while they were driving around Hollywood and thinking about what witty lines they could add to improve the final moments of the movie. And they just shouted at each other at the same time.
Round up the usual suspects, yeah.
Yeah, just because they were twins, and twins often have this really uncanny ability to mirror each other.
Absolutely, yeah. They also added quite late, I think it might have been the day of filming, when the line where Rick says, "I think this is the start of beautiful friendship," which, has entered the popular lexicon for sure. So let's talk about. So they finished the movie, they wrapped production, and this was back in the 40s when productions would wrap very quickly and very quickly go to theaters. It came out basically at the perfect time. It was released about a year after Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. had finally entered World War II and had already begun its campaign to assert naval dominance in the Atlantic. And in November 1942, just before the release of the movie, something huge would happen.
Yeah, the city that gave the title to the movie was stormed by the Americans.
Operation Torch.
As far as I understand it, it was more that because Operation Torch happened, they pushed up the release schedule.
That's clever, yeah. Make it timely.
Yeah, they just happened to have this movie ready to go, and it just happened at a very convenient time. So Operation Torch, it was a really brilliant maneuver just because of how crazy it was. In the same way that the Germans were able to have so much success with the Blitzkrieg tactic, because nobody expected them to do this. The Americans just decided that, they're going to successfully transport well over 100,000 troops into Morocco over the Atlantic. And this was at a time when there was already war between Nazi Germany and the United States. So there were a lot of submarines in the Atlantic. It was very treacherous waters. Just a lot of people couldn't believe that they would be able to transport this many troops into Morocco without anybody noticing. But they were able to set up some diversions. The Germans were under the impression that the Americans were actually on their way to provide supplies to Malta or possibly Senegal. But in reality, they set up this operation such that there would be an eastern front, which would disembark just a bit north of Casablanca at a port called Sif. Yeah, so the operation was divided into three task forces. You had the Western Task Force, which would disembark in Morocco itself on the ports of Sefi, Amin Fadala, and on Port Lyautey, which would help give them a stranglehold over Morocco itself and do a pincer movement to take over this vast country. And Casablanca itself was the important part because, again, it's a vital port. It's huge. It has a lot of capacity. So if they can take Casablanca, they'll be able to transport a lot of supplies to Europe, which would be desperately needed now that they were about to come face to face with the Nazis. You had the Central Task Force, which was tasked with taking Oran, and you had the Eastern Task Force, which was supposed to take Algiers. And Algiers was actually taken by a resistance network. As for the rest of these operations, they were just done with this stunning speed. Like, their objectives were realized in just over a week. The operation began on November 8th and was completed on November 16th. It's just classic American chutzpah. And it was at this point that the sleaziness of many of the Vichy French really shone through. As we hopefully made explicitly clear, Vichy was a collaborationist regime, but that didn't mean that they were necessarily puppets. And you had a lot of really opportunistic types. And
I gotta say, the movie depicts that. Yeah, Renault is absolutely that kind of person.
Yeah, and one of these really sketchy types was Admiral de Roland, whom we mentioned previously. He was the admiral of the French fleet, who wanted to go to war against the British Navy because of what happened at Mers el-Kebir. But de Roland, he was able to very effectively maneuver himself. He was a very political creature, and he was able to basically go over to the Allied side by guaranteeing that there would be minimal bloodshed, even though he had been a very notorious collaborator and took an active part in anti-Semitic persecutions at the time. But the deal was that he would maintain political power in North Africa for the duration of the war. And he was even able to secure Pétain's permission for a ceasefire originally before Nazi Germany caught wind of this and actually, intervened, because this is kind of a no-no for your collaborators to start double dealing with the Americans.
And as everybody knows, as the war was ramping up, the actual war was ramping up in North Africa and eventually in Europe, you had basically the home front of the U.S. was increasingly mobilizing. So you had eventually the American film industry would become itself sort of looped into the war effort. Because of that, many fewer films would end up being produced after the early 1941, 1942. So in a sense, Casablanca was sort of the end of the studio system for a bit, because so many filmmakers ended up being brought in to do wartime stuff, such as, propaganda films, documentaries like the Why We Fight series. You even had this fear that the studios themselves might actually be military targets of sabotage. So a lot of the buildings at the Warner Brothers and Universal lots were actually reinforced with, new metal bars and sandbags, because they were worried that somebody might try to bomb them to stop propaganda films from being made to support the war effort.
Yeah, so Darlan, he goes over to the Ally side. He wouldn't last very long. He had a notorious reputation that preceded him, and so just over a month after this deal was struck, on December 24th, he was actually shot and killed by an assassin who was a monarchist, which again speaks to the really weird intricacies of French politics that Anglos tend to overlook a lot of the time, because it doesn't map on very cleanly to our own politics. But perhaps just as an interesting what if Mirza al-Kabir could have been avoided? After North Africa was taken, at this point, all bets are off, and Nazi Germany launched Operation Fall Anton, which saw the occupation of the rest of France. And it was at this point that you saw a very interesting thing happen, where when the German military tried to take the remainder of the French Navy, they actually scuttled their own ships to prevent them from falling into German hands. So yeah, this just goes to show that the French were, I guess, serious about maintaining their independence from Germans to some degree. Yeah, so the war continued in North Africa, but it was very clear that because of this operation and the American push eastward, Rommel was cornered. He would no longer be able to. He would never be able to scurry around like he would, as his nickname, the Desert Fox, suggests. And yeah, he was soundly defeated. North Africa was taken. And so America and the Allies had a staging ground to attack Italy.
Right. And so as the war was ramping up in Europe, eventually, as they prepared to get into Italy, you started seeing this kind of similar ramp up on the home front. There was this big fear of disunity in the U.S., this belief that they really had to get the entire country behind the war effort. This obviously would have its most unfortunate implications with the imprisonment, or at least internment, of so many thousands of Japanese Americans. But the kind of more positive side was that tons of films were produced with an effort to support the war effort. Although Casablanca was filmed before that really got started, it was part of this broader effort. You saw a whole bunch of propaganda films, many of them documentaries being produced, a lot of them being produced in Europe and North Africa. And you even had all these kind of strange measures being taken by the studios to defend themselves physically from the threat of attack or sabotage. They really believed they were an essential part of the war effort, to the extent that they actually reinforced the studios with armed guards and sandbag barricades, because they were convinced that these films would be so dangerous to the Axis that German or Japanese spies might be sent to sabotage the film production. What this means was that when the film came out in November 1942, just after the end of Operation Torch, as U.S. troops began, marching across North Africa, the audiences totally ate up Casablanca. It came out at the perfect time, although we should mention that despite its popularity among audiences, critics were a little more guarded. Here we have, if you want to read Russian, Sam, Aljan Hametz in the book Round Up the Usual Suspects.
There was some dissent, mostly in the highbrow magazines. Quote, the Casablanca kind of hokum was good in its original context in other movies, but lifted into Casablanca for the sake of its glitter and not incorporated into it loses its meaning. Manny Farber wrote in The New Republic, The New Yorker called the film, quote, pretty tolerable, although not as good as Humphrey Bogart's earlier pictures. In The Nation, James Agee first offered grudging praise. Quote, Casablanca, which I must say I liked, is working up a rather serious reputation as a fine melodrama. Why? It is obviously an improvement on one of the world's worst plays, but it is not such an improvement that it is not obvious.
Yeah. Well, nevertheless, Casablanca's success at the box office would eventually extend to the Oscars. It would be lavishly praised at the 16th Academy Awards, taking home Best Picture. Although some years later, James Agee was approached again if he still felt this way about Casablanca, and he would say,
Casablanca is still reverently spoken of as 1, fun, 2, a real movie. I think it is the year's clearest measure of how willingly people will deceive themselves. Even Genie, hardly a movie at all, was better fun. Well, I may disagree with Mr. Agee, but I gotta say, props for sticking to his guns and refusing to let the mob dictate his hater thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it shows that you really cannot please everybody. But I guess this also goes to show that, like many of the other classics we've talked about in this podcast before, like Nosferatu, Casablanca really took on a life of its own after its release. In the 90s, Roger Ebert would say that Casablanca has a claim to be the movie. It represents the studio system at its best and brightest. But I guess the question I have, which a lot of people have talked about before, and there's not a single answer at all, but I have to wonder, what do you think, Russian Sam? Why is Casablanca so beloved and so long-lasting?
I think it's because it was a very well-crafted propaganda film. And when I say propaganda, I don't mean that in the negative sense.
Yeah, it serves a political purpose very well, but it also tells a beautiful story.
Yeah, and it just really helps to capture the mood of euphoria that was present in the country at the time. I understood basically Rick as representing America in this story.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I mean, that at first Rick is really cynical and just cares about making money, as Americans are prone to do. But as the story develops and as the consequences of not standing up for freedom become clearer and clearer, Rick just decides that, he can't stay in the sidelines. He absolutely must contribute to this, and he must let his sympathies shine through. And in the same way as Rick decided that he's going to help Laszlo come to America, America decided that it's going to help to bring freedom to Europe.
Right, and that's exactly it. And there's so many metaphors throughout the movie. Probably the most famous is when he says, "Oh, I bet they're asleep in New York. I bet they're asleep all over America." Or then, what does Reno say? Something like, "In these times, one can no longer be neutral."
I believe it was, "In times such as these, one can no longer afford to be an isolationist."
Oh, thank you. Of course. Yeah. And another interesting metaphor that actually my mom pointed out a few years ago, which I think is quite true, is that in a sense, the whole movie is sort of metaphorical because Rick's relationship with Ilsa is kind of a parallel for the idea of pre-war or interwar Europe as this kind of innocent time that can never be recovered. Rick will never be in Paris with Ilsa again, just as the world will never be able to go back to the early 1930s. This is a new era with new higher stakes where the game has changed. And once the game has changed, you really can never turn it back. And I think that one important consideration here that makes Casablanca pretty unusual and goes back to the fact that it is, at the end of the day, a propaganda piece, is that in the movie, Rick makes a choice that very few other film characters make, at least in American mainstream films. He chooses, above love, to pursue his duty for his country. Rick's main decision across the film, his main character transformation, is to no longer be independent and instead do what is right, which in this case means what is right for America. I think this is a case in which American patriotism is pretty clearly I guess you can say a progressive force considering what it's up against. But I think you also have to wonder that is this a sincere anti-fascist sentiment, or is this kind of a more dangerous, kind of blind patriotism? It's obviously, you always feel like kind of a party pooper whenever you criticize any outpouring of American patriotism when the opponent of the United States is clearly so much worse. But because we've seen the ways that blind American patriotism or blind patriotism of any kind leads to such horrible ends, I think we do have to ask questions about Casablanca. You mentioned earlier, Sam, the fact that many of the French collaborationists in the Vichy government were not themselves avowed fascists. They had no love for Germany at all. But because they believed they were patriots, they supported the French state. When the French state became German aligned, they went with it. And I think that it makes me wonder, what is the message of Casablanca? Is it saying you should follow your government to the ends of the earth? Or do you think it's saying that fascism is a unique evil that should be uniquely combated?
I would have to say that it's more the latter, but granted, this is more me speaking with knowledge and hindsight that the people who made this movie would be persecuted for, being under suspicion of being communists. So,
right, yeah. Both, we should mention, all three of the writers, Howard Koch and Julius and Philip Epstein, would later be brought up as suspected communists once after the war, once the Red Scare got underway. One kind of cute little story with the Epstein brothers is that because they had been involved in these anti-fascist films in World War II, and they were very strong anti-fascists, they were asked at one point if they had ever been part of any subversive left-wing organization. They said something like, "Oh yeah, it's called Warner Brothers."
Hey, remember when they were subversive for a good cause?
Oh yeah, I know, right? You did see some pretty funny pro-Soviet movies coming out in the early 40s, and then suddenly 45 totally did a 180.
Yeah, there's one titled like Uncle Joe or something like that.
Oh yeah, no, there's one called Mission to Moscow. Maybe we should do an episode on that, 1943, where they just say, the Moscow trials, those were great.
Yeah, God, what a weird time.
No, really, yeah. But as we talk about, the world we got, Casablanca is just a really good illustration of this particular moment. And I think the fact that Casablanca is this movie that puts duty over love in a way you rarely see in American film points to the fact that it was made in a moment where the expectations of art were a lot different than they are today. When the film industry was doing something that might not have been entirely for profit, and might have had sort of different emotional sensibility than many modern day mainstream artists do. And I find that quite interesting. Roger Ebert, who we mentioned before, has a pretty interesting perspective here about Casablanca, where he says, "At the end of the day, Casablanca is not a movie about love. It's a movie about nobility. The great break between this film and almost all Hollywood love stories, even wartime romances, is that it doesn't believe love can or should conquer all. As I analyze my own feelings about the small handful of films that affect me deeply, I find that I'm hardly ever moved by love, but I'm often moved by self-sacrifice." Michael Curtiz's direction of Casablanca is remarkable for being completely economical. Mostly, he uses the basic repertoire of cinematic storytelling: establishing shot, movement, medium shot, POV, reaction. Is there a single shot that calls attention to itself for its own sake? I can't think of one. There are dozens in Citizen Kane. Nobody ever asks, "Remember that great shot in Casablanca?" because there are no great shots in Casablanca. The film is at the service of its characters and story.
Liam, thank you so much for suggesting this movie, and we definitely have more of this kind of stuff down the pipeline.
You're totally right. Interwar, wartime Morocco is a crazy topic, and I really can't wait to learn more about this soon. I also think that, interwar, early World War II era film is a really fun topic, and I want to do a lot more of these movie episodes about this specific period, particularly non-American ones. I think that could be really fun.
Oh, all right. Play it, Abram. Just once.